My daughter mocked my old clothes until she saw a picture of who I used to be. My daughter found the photograph at 3:47 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock, waiting for her to leave so I could finally have some peace. She was standing in my bedroom doorway, holding a faded picture in her hand, and her face had gone completely white. For the first time in 3 years, Madison wasn't looking at me with that expression of disgust and disappointment she'd perfected. She was looking at me like she'd just seen a ghost. And in a way, I suppose, she had. She was looking at who I used to be, someone she never knew existed, someone I'd buried so deep I almost forgot myself. Before I tell you what happened next, let me say this. If you're watching this story, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. And if you want to hear more stories about family secrets and the things we hide from the people we love most, go ahead and subscribe. Because what I'm about to tell you is something I've never spoken about to anyone. Not my daughter, not my late husband, not even my best friend of 40 years. But after what happened last weekend, after everything fell apart and came back together in the strangest way possible, I realized that some secrets are more damaging than the truth could ever be. My name is Kristen Bell. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of how my daughter learned that the frumpy old woman she was ashamed of used to be someone very different. The comment that started everything came 3 weeks before Madison found the photograph. We were at Nordstrom and she was shopping for her engagement party. Madison is 34, works in tech, makes more money at 34 than I made in my entire career, and she's marrying a man named Trevor who wears expensive suits and talks about cryptocurrency like it's a religion. They're good people, I suppose, but they live in a world I don't understand anymore. A world where everything is about image and status and making sure everyone knows how successful you are. Madison was trying on dresses, and I was sitting in one of those uncomfortable chairs they put in fitting rooms, wearing my usual outfit. A floral blouse I'd bought at Target 8 years ago, loose-fitting khaki pants because my knees hurt and I need comfortable clothes, and my old white sneakers that Madison calls my grandma shoes. She came out in a beautiful navy dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, and she looked at me with this expression I'd seen too many times before, that mixture of frustration and embarrassment that seemed to be her default setting whenever we were in public together. She said, "Mom, you can't wear that to my engagement party. You just can't. Everyone from Trevor's family is going to be there, and his mother is, well, she's very elegant, very put together." I looked down at my clothes and felt that familiar shame creep up my neck. The shame that had become my constant companion over the past few years as Madison's life got bigger and shinier and mine stayed small and faded. I told her I could wear my church dress, the gray one I'd bought for her cousin's wedding 5 years ago. Madison closed her eyes like I'd just caused her physical pain. She said, "That dress is ancient, Mom. It's outdated and it makes you look so old, and I'm sorry, but it's embarrassing. Why can't you just try a little? Why can't you care about how you look?" I felt the words hit me like a slap, but I didn't say anything. What could I say? She was right, in a way. I had let myself go. After George died 4 years ago, after I retired from my job as an elementary school teacher, after my world shrank down to my small house in the suburbs and my garden and my weekly grocery shopping trips, I stopped caring about clothes and makeup and all the things that used to matter. I became invisible. And maybe part of me wanted to be invisible. It was easier than trying to keep up with a world that had moved on without me. Madison stood there in that expensive dress, looking at me with those disappointed eyes, and she said something that I've replayed in my mind every day since. She said, "I just wish you'd put in some effort. Trevor's mom is going to be there in Chanel, and you're going to show up looking like someone's grandma from a nursing home. It's like you've given up on life completely." The saleswoman pretended not to hear. I pretended not to feel the tears burning behind my eyes. Madison went back into the fitting room, and I sat there in my old lady clothes, feeling exactly as small and worthless as my daughter clearly thought I was. On the drive home, we didn't speak. Madison drove her Tesla in silence while I stared out the window at the world passing by, thinking about how I'd become someone even my own daughter was ashamed of. When she dropped me off at my house, she kissed my cheek and said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I just want you to look nice. Is that so wrong?" I told her it wasn't wrong. I told her I understood. I told her I'd try to find something better to wear. She smiled then, relieved, and drove away in her expensive car to her expensive life, and I walked into my quiet house feeling more alone than I'd felt since George died. For 3 weeks, I tried. I went to the mall by myself and wandered through stores where everything seemed designed for women half my age. I stood in front of my closet every morning and stared at clothes that suddenly seemed even more pathetic than before. I thought about going to a hairdresser and doing something with my gray hair that I'd been wearing in the same short, practical style for 20 years. But every time I looked in the mirror, all I saw was an old woman with wrinkles and age spots and a body that had carried a child and lived 72 years. No amount of expensive clothes was going to change that. So I did what I'd been doing for years. I pushed down the hurt and told myself that Madison was probably right. I had let myself go. I had become someone forgettable. The Saturday that changed everything started like any other. Madison came over to bring me some groceries because she worried I wasn't eating enough, which was sweet, but also felt like another way of saying I couldn't take care of myself. She let herself in with the spare key I'd given her and immediately started unpacking organic vegetables and expensive yogurt that I'd never buy for myself. She was talking about the engagement party, about the caterer they'd hired and the venue they'd booked, and how Trevor's entire family was flying in from New York. I was only half listening because I was trying to remember if I'd taken my blood pressure medication that morning. Then Madison said she needed to use the bathroom, and I heard her footsteps going upstairs instead of going downstairs, which meant she was going to see the mess in my bedroom. I'd been going through old boxes the night before, boxes I'd kept in the attic for years and finally brought down because I was thinking about George and missing him and wanting to remember when we were young. Boxes full of photographs and letters and memories I'd packed away because looking at them hurt too much. I'd meant to put them back, but I'd fallen asleep in my chair watching television, and they were still scattered across my bedroom floor when Madison went upstairs. I heard her footsteps stop, heard the silence that meant she'd seen something, and then I heard her voice, strange and small, calling down to me. She said, "Mom, Mom, can you come up here?" My knees hurt as I climbed the stairs, and I was already trying to think of excuses for the mess, already preparing myself for another lecture about how I needed to keep the house cleaner, how I was living in the past, how I needed to move forward. But when I got to my bedroom doorway, Madison wasn't looking at the boxes on the floor. She was standing by my dresser, holding a photograph in her hand, staring at it like she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes were wide. And when she looked up at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in her face in years: complete and total shock. The photograph was from 1974. I was 24 years old. It was taken at a fashion show in Milan, and I was wearing a white Yves Saint Laurent gown that had been specially fitted for me. My hair was long and dark, styled in the way everyone wore it back then, and I was thin, the kind of thin that came from living on cigarettes and coffee and the nervous energy of youth. I was smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who knew she was beautiful, who knew the whole world was watching her. The photograph had been in a magazine, Vogue Italia, and someone had clipped it and sent it to me, and I'd kept it all these years, even though looking at it felt like looking at a stranger. Madison's voice came out as barely a whisper when she asked, "Is this you?" I nodded, suddenly unable to speak, because I knew what was coming next. I knew all the questions that would follow, all the explanations I'd have to give, all the secrets I'd kept locked away for 50 years. Madison looked at the photograph again, then at me, then back at the photograph. She said, "This is you? This is actually you? You were a model?" I told her yes, I was a model. She said, "Like a professional model? A real model?" And there was something in her voice, something between disbelief and accusation, like I'd been lying to her all these years. Which, in a way, I suppose I had. I'd never told Madison about that part of my life. Never mentioned the years I spent in Europe, walking runways and shooting for magazines, and living a life that seemed impossibly glamorous, and also impossibly empty. She started looking through the other photographs scattered on my bed. There were dozens of them. Me in Paris, wearing Givenchy at a party with people whose names she'd recognize if I told her. Me in London on the cover of a fashion magazine I can't even remember the name of. Me in New York at Studio 54 with my arm around a famous actor who's now been dead for 20 years. Me young and beautiful and living a life that seemed, from the outside, like a fairy tale. Madison picked up each photograph like she was handling evidence at a crime scene. She kept saying, "I don't understand. I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Her voice was getting louder, more upset, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. I sat down on the edge of my bed, suddenly feeling exhausted, feeling every one of my 72 years. I told her I didn't tell her because it didn't matter, because that person in the photographs wasn't really me, not the real me. Because that whole world was something I left behind a long time ago and never wanted to return to. Madison sat down next to me, still holding a photograph of me from 1976, wearing a dress she'd probably seen in a fashion museum somewhere. She said, "How can you say it doesn't matter? Mom, you were famous. You were beautiful. You were somebody." And there it was, the thing she'd been thinking about me all along. That now I wasn't somebody. That I'd somehow failed by becoming old and ordinary. I took the photograph from her hands and looked at the young woman in it. 26 years old in that picture. Thin as a rail because the modeling agency told me I needed to lose 10 pounds, even though I was already underweight. Standing in front of a camera, pretending to be happy, while inside I felt hollow and used up and desperately lonely. I started then, telling Madison things I'd never planned to tell her, things I'd never told anyone. I told her I started modeling when I was 17, discovered by a scout in a shopping mall in Minneapolis, where I grew up. I told her I moved to New York 3 weeks after graduating high school, got signed to an agency, and within 6 months I was working steadily, making more money than my parents had ever seen. I told her about the photographers who wanted me to do things I didn't want to do, who said it was normal, who said if I wanted to be successful, I had to be cooperative. I told her about the pills everyone took to stay thin, the cocaine that was everywhere in the 70s, the way the industry chewed up young girls and spit them out when they turned 25 and were suddenly too old. I told her about the eating disorder I developed, how I'd go days without eating anything but black coffee and cigarettes, how I'd look in the mirror at my jutting hip bones and still think I was fat because that's what everyone kept telling me. I told her about the loneliness of being in a room full of people and feeling completely invisible, about being valued only for my appearance, about the terror I felt watching myself age, knowing that my entire worth was tied to something that would inevitably fade. Madison was crying now, really crying, and she said, "But you were so beautiful. You could have had anything." I took her hand and held it tight. I told her that's exactly the problem. I did have everything that world valued, and it made me miserable. I told her I quit modeling when I was 28, walked away from contracts and opportunities and money because I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't stand the way men looked at me like I was just a body, couldn't stand the empty conversations and the fake friends and the constant pressure to stay young and thin and perfect. I moved back to Minnesota, went to college for the first time in my life, got my teaching degree, and met George at a coffee shop near campus. George, who thought I was pretty, but loved me from my mind, who didn't care that I'd gained 30 pounds and cut my hair short, who wanted to know about my thoughts and dreams instead of just staring at my body. I told Madison that the happiest years of my life weren't the ones in those photographs. They were the years teaching second grade, watching kids learn to read, the years raising her in our small house with the garden in the back, the quiet evenings with George watching television and holding hands. I told her I never mentioned my modeling career because I didn't want it to define me, didn't want her to think that being beautiful was the most important thing a woman could be. I wanted her to value herself for her intelligence and kindness and strength, not for how she looked in a dress. Madison was staring at me with tears running down her face, and she said something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. She said, "I've been so terrible to you. I've been so ashamed of you.
And you were literally famous, and you gave it all up, and I didn't even know." Her voice was shaking, and she was sobbing now, really sobbing. She said, "I called you embarrassing. I said you looked like someone from a nursing home, and you were on the cover of Vogue, and I didn't even know because you never told me, and I'm such a terrible daughter." I pulled her close and let her cry against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was little and had a bad dream. I told her she wasn't terrible. I told her I understood why she'd been frustrated with me, why she wanted me to look more put together, why my appearance embarrassed her. In her world, in the world she lived in, with Trevor and his fancy family, appearance mattered. Success was measured by how you looked, what you wore, what car you drove. She'd been raised in a different time than me, a time when social media made everyone's life public, when being beautiful and successful meant something different than it did in my day. But then I told her something else, something I'd been wanting to say for 3 years, but never had the courage. I told her that the reason I stopped trying with my appearance wasn't because I'd given up on life. It was because I'd finally given up on the idea
that my worth came from how I looked. I told her that after George died, after I lost the man who loved me when I was young and beautiful and still loved me just as much when I was old and ordinary, I realized something important. The people who love you for your appearance will stop loving you when your appearance changes. The people who love you for who you are will love you forever. I told her I wore comfortable clothes because my body hurt and I deserved to be comfortable. I wore my hair short because it was easy and I didn't care about being glamorous anymore. I wore my grandma's shoes because they didn't hurt my feet and I'd spent enough years of my life in painful high heels. I told her I wasn't embarrassing, I wasn't a failure, I wasn't someone who'd given up. I was someone who'd finally figured out what mattered and what didn't. And if Trevor's mother in her Chanel suit couldn't see past my Target blouse to the person underneath, then that said more about her than it did about me. Madison pulled back and looked at me with red, swollen eyes. She said, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." She picked up another photograph, this one from 1975, me walking down a runway in Paris. She said, "You gave all this up? You really just walked away?" I told her I ran away. I ran as fast as I could because staying would have killed me, maybe literally. I told her that world, that beautiful, glamorous world everyone thinks they want, it's built on a foundation of insecurity and exploitation. I told her the only real freedom I'd ever found was in letting go of the need to be beautiful, in letting myself age naturally, in choosing comfort over appearance. We sat there on my bed for a long time, surrounded by photographs of someone I used to be. Madison kept looking at them, kept asking questions about the places I'd been and the people I'd met. I told her stories I'd never told anyone, about the time I met David Bowie at a party in London, and he was kind and strange and brilliant, about the photographer who became my friend and tried to protect me from the darker side of the industry, about the Italian designer who told me I had the most beautiful walk he'd ever seen and created an entire collection inspired by me, about the loneliness of hotel rooms in foreign cities, about being 19 years old and so far from home, about calling my mother from Paris and crying because I was homesick and exhausted and wanted to quit but didn't know how. Madison said, "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? Why did you keep it secret?" I told her I wasn't keeping it secret exactly. I just didn't think it was relevant. I didn't want her to grow up thinking that being beautiful was an achievement or that modeling was glamorous. I wanted her to focus on school and her mind and building a life based on substance rather than image. I told her I was afraid if she knew about my past, she'd value the wrong things. She'd think beauty mattered more than character. She'd think fame was worth pursuing. And look what happened anyway. Even without knowing about my modeling career, she'd still ended up in a world where appearance was everything, where she was ashamed of her own mother for not being elegant enough. Madison was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised me. She said, "Trevor's mother makes me feel the way I made you feel. Like I'm never quite good enough, like I need to try harder, dress better, be thinner, be more successful." She looks at me like I'm embarrassing Trevor by not being perfect. Her voice got very small. She said, "I did to you exactly what she does to me, and I hate it when she does it, but I did it anyway." I held her hand and told her that's how these patterns work. We learn them from someone, and then we pass them on without even realizing it. Trevor's mother probably learned it from her mother. Madison learned it from the world she lived in, from social media and magazines, and a culture that tells women their value comes from their appearance. I told her the only way to break the pattern is to recognize it and choose differently, to decide that you're going to value people, including yourself, for things that matter, for kindness and intelligence and humor and love, for the way they treat others, for who they are when nobody's watching. Madison asked me what happened to all the money I made modeling. She'd done the math, realized I must have made substantial income during those years. I told her most of it went to the agency, to the apartment in New York that cost a fortune, to the lifestyle everyone expected models to maintain. But I did save some. I used it to pay for college when I went back to school. I used it for the down payment on the house where George and I raised her. I used it to pay for her college education so she wouldn't have student loans. She stared at me. She said, "My college fund came from your modeling money?" I nodded. She started crying again. She said, "I've been such a brat. I've been so focused on appearances and status, and you paid for my education with money from a career you hated, and I didn't even know. And I've been treating you like you're worthless." I told her she hadn't been treating me like I was worthless, not really. She'd just been scared. Scared that I'd embarrass her, scared that Trevor's family would judge her based on me, scared of not measuring up to some impossible standard. I told her I understood that fear because I'd lived with it for years when I was modeling. The constant fear that I wasn't thin enough, pretty enough, young enough, good enough. It was exhausting then, and it's still exhausting now. And the only way to stop being exhausted is to stop caring what other people think. Madison picked up the photograph from Milan again, the one with me in the white Yves Saint Laurent gown. She said, "Will you tell me about this one? About what it was like?" So I told her. I told her it was 1974, and I was 24 years old, and I'd just been chosen to close the show for one of the biggest designers in the world. I told her I remember standing backstage, wearing that incredible dress, feeling the weight of it and the way it moved. I told her I remember walking out onto the runway, the lights blinding me, the audience a blur of faces. I told her I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment everyone thinks they want. And I remember feeling completely empty, completely alone, wondering if this was really what success looked like, wondering if there was something wrong with me that I wasn't happier. I told her that 2 years later, I met a photographer named Sarah who became my best friend. Sarah was the one who finally said what I'd been thinking for years. She said, "You know you can leave, right? You can just walk away. This industry will replace you in a second, but you can't replace yourself." So I did. I finished my contracts, said no to new ones, and left New York on a cold January morning in 1978. I was 28 years old. Some people in the industry thought I was crazy. Some thought I'd gotten too old. Some thought I'd had a breakdown. But I knew I was saving my own life. Madison asked me if I ever regretted it, if I ever looked back and wished I'd stayed, wished I'd held on to that beauty and fame and success. I told her the truth. I told her that sometimes, in the early years, I'd see magazines with other models on the cover and feel a strange pang of something like regret. But it wasn't really regret. It was more like nostalgia for being young, for having my whole life ahead of me. What I never regretted was the decision itself. Because if I'd stayed, I never would have met George, never would have had her, never would have spent 30 years teaching children to read, never would have had a real life, a meaningful life, a life that mattered. She asked me if I was happy now.
If I was happy being old and ordinary and wearing Target clothes and grandma shoes?
Thought about it for a moment, really thought about it. Then I told her yes. I told her I was happier now than I'd ever been when I was young and beautiful. Because now I knew who I was. I wasn't a body that other people looked at and judged. I wasn't a dress size or a face in a photograph. I was a woman who'd lived a full life, who'd loved and been loved, who'd raised a daughter and taught hundreds of children and planted a garden and read thousands of books and survived grief and loneliness and pain. I was a woman who'd learned that comfort matters more than beauty, that kindness matters more than status, that being real matters more than being perfect. Madison hugged me then, really hugged me, the way she used to when she was little. She said, "I don't want you to change anything about the way you dress. I don't want you to buy expensive clothes or dye your hair or try to look younger. I want you to come to my engagement party exactly as you are, in your Target blouse and your comfortable pants and your grandma shoes. And if Trevor's mother has a problem with it, that's her problem, not yours." I laughed, and she laughed, and we sat there surrounded by photographs of a life I'd left behind, feeling closer than we'd felt in years. That night, Madison stayed for dinner. We ordered pizza and sat at my kitchen table, and she asked me more questions about my modeling years. About the cities I'd lived in and the famous people I'd met and the crazy things that happened. I told her about the time I fell on a runway in front of 2,000 people and just got up and kept walking, because that's what you did. I told her about the designer who threw a tantrum and threw a shoe at his assistant because a hem was wrong. I told her about the model who became bulimic and ended up in the hospital, and everyone just replaced her and moved on like she'd never existed. I told her about the darkness underneath all that glamour, about the eating disorders and drug abuse and mental health problems that nobody talked about, because talking about them would ruin the fantasy. Madison listened to everything, and I could see her processing it all, rethinking everything she thought she knew about beauty and success and what matters in life. Finally, she said, "I need to apologize to you properly, not just for the clothes thing, but for everything. For making you feel small, for being ashamed of you, for caring more about what Trevor's family thinks than about your comfort and happiness. I've been a terrible daughter, and I'm so sorry." I told her she hadn't been terrible. She'd been human. She'd been influenced by a culture that values all the wrong things. But the important thing was that she recognized it now and could choose differently going forward. Before she left that night, Madison took one of the photographs with her, the one from Milan, with me in the white gown. She said she wanted to frame it and put it in her apartment so she'd remember. Remember that I used to be someone the world thought was important, but that I gave it up for something better. Remember that beauty fades, but character doesn't. Remember that her mother was once young and beautiful and famous, but chose to be old and ordinary and happy instead. 3 weeks later, I went to Madison's engagement party. I wore my church dress, the gray one Madison had called ancient and outdated. I wore my comfortable shoes. I did my hair the same way I always did. And when I walked in, Madison met me at the door with tears in her eyes. She hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for being exactly who you are." Trevor's mother was there in her Chanel, looking elegant and expensive and carefully maintained. She glanced at me once with that look I'd seen 1,000 times before, that look that said I wasn't worth her attention. But Madison saw it, and she walked right up to her future mother-in-law with me on her arm and said, "I want you to meet my mother. She used to be an international fashion model, but she gave it all up because she realized there were more important things in life than how you look. She's the strongest, wisest woman I know." Trevor's mother's expression changed completely. Suddenly, I wasn't just some frumpy old woman in outdated clothes. I was someone with a history, someone interesting, someone worthy of attention. She wanted to know all about my modeling career, wanted to hear stories about the designers I'd worked with and the cities I'd lived in. And I saw Madison watching this interaction, seeing how quickly her future mother-in-law's perception of me changed once she knew about my past, seeing how shallow and conditional that kind of respect was. After a few minutes of polite conversation, Madison pulled me away and we went to get drinks. She said, "Did you see that?
"Did you see how she changed when she found out you used to be somebody?" I told her I saw it, and I told her that's exactly why I never tell people about that part of my life. Because the people who respect you only when they learn you used to be famous or beautiful are the same people who'll stop respecting you when you get old and ordinary. The party was lovely. I met Trevor's family and Madison's friends and ate food that was too fancy and made small talk about nothing important. But the best part of the night was watching Madison. Watching her laugh and dance and hold Trevor's hand without that tense, worried expression she always used to have. Watching her glance over at me every so often and smile, really smile, like she was genuinely happy I was there instead of embarrassed. At the end of the night, as people were leaving, Madison came over and sat next to me. She said, "I'm going to be different from now on. I'm not going to care so much about appearances and status and what other people think. I'm going to remember what matters." I squeezed her hand and told her I was proud of her. Told her that recognizing the problem was the first step, but the real work would come in following through, in choosing substance over style every day, in resisting the constant pressure to be perfect. A month after the engagement party, Madison came over for Sunday dinner, like she used to do before our relationship got strained. She brought a gift, a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. She told me to open it, and when I did, I found a framed photograph. It was the one from Milan, me and the white Yves Saint Laurent gown. But she'd had it professionally restored and enlarged and framed beautifully. Underneath the photograph, she'd added a small plaque. It said, "Kristen Bell, 1974, my mother, who was beautiful enough to be on the cover of Vogue, but wise enough to know that wasn't what mattered." I cried when I read it. Madison cried too. We hung the photograph in my living room, right above the fireplace, where I had a painting of flowers that George bought me years ago. Now, every time I sit in my living room, I see that young woman in her designer gown, and I remember who I was and who I am now. I remember the journey from there to here, from beautiful and empty to ordinary and full, from valued for my appearance to valued for my character, from trying to be perfect to embracing being real. Madison and I are closer now than we've been in years. She still lives her life, still works her demanding job and plans her wedding and sees her friends. But something shifted after she found those photographs. She calls me more often. She asks my advice about things that matter instead of just complaining about things that don't. She stopped apologizing for my appearance when we're in public together. She stopped trying to change me into someone I'm not. And most importantly, she started questioning the values she'd absorbed from her world, started pushing back against the pressure to be perfect, started choosing authenticity over appearance. Last week, she told me she'd had a conversation with Trevor's mother about
Expectations for the wedding. Trevor's mother wanted Madison to lose 15 pounds before the big day, said it would look better in photographs. Madison told her no, told her she was happy with her body the way it was, told her that she'd learned from her mother that true beauty has nothing to do with dress size or perfect photographs. She said Trevor's mother was shocked, probably offended, but Madison didn't care. She said, "I spent too many years worrying about what other people think. I'm done with that now." I've thought a lot about that Saturday afternoon when Madison found the photographs, about how one moment can change everything, how the truth can set you free even when you didn't know you were trapped. I'd spent 50 years keeping that part of my life separate from who I became, thinking I was protecting Madison by not telling her about my modeling career. But maybe I was actually hurting her by letting her believe that I'd always been ordinary, that I'd never had opportunities or beauty or success. Maybe if I'd told her earlier about that life and why I left it, she would have understood sooner that appearance isn't everything. Or maybe it happened exactly when it needed to happen. Maybe Madison needed to go through her own journey of valuing the wrong things and then realizing her mistake. Maybe the lesson meant more because she learned it herself instead of being taught it. Maybe that's how wisdom works. You can't just tell people what matters, they have to discover it for themselves. What I know now is that the photographs don't haunt me anymore. They don't represent a life I lost or a person I used to be. They represent a chapter in a long story, a time when I learned important lessons about what I didn't want to be. They remind me that I had the courage to walk away from something that looked perfect on the outside but felt empty on the inside. They remind me that I chose substance over surface, meaning over money, love over fame. And they remind me that real beauty isn't about youth or thinness or expensive clothes. Real beauty is about authenticity and courage and living a life that's true to who you really are. So, if you're still watching this story, if you've stayed with me all the way to the end, I want to thank you. Thank you for listening to an old woman talk about her life and her daughter and the complicated relationship between appearance and worth. And if this story resonated with you at all, if it made you think about your own life and the values you've been chasing, do me one more favor. Hit that subscribe button. Because we need more stories about choosing substance over style, about valuing people for who they are instead of how they look, about the courage it takes to be ordinary in a world that's obsessed with being extraordinary. My name is Kristen Bell. I'm 72 years old. I used to be beautiful enough for the cover of Vogue, and now I wear Target blouses and grandma shoes, and I've never been happier in my entire life. Because I finally figured out what my daughter is just now learning, that the most important things in life can't be photographed or displayed or judged by strangers. The most important things are invisible to everyone except the people who truly love you. And those are the only people whose opinions matter anyway.